A wealthy businessman dines in luxury, until a poor, elderly man is refused service before his eyes. The room watches in silence, judgment hanging in the air. But then, the restaurant owner steps in. What happens next will challenge everything they believe about power, dignity, and humanity. Stay till the end, because this story might just change the way you see the world. The aroma of freshly baked bread and sizzling butter filled the lavish dining hall of Grayson's Fine Dining, one of New York City's most prestigious restaurants. Chandeliers glowed with golden light, reflecting off polished marble floors. Crystal glasses clinked in celebration, and murmured conversations blended with the soft melody of a live piano, creating an atmosphere of exclusivity and grandeur. The restaurant catered to the elite, politicians, CEOs, and celebrities, those who dined on filet mignon and caviar without glancing at the prices. The waitstaff moved with precision, balancing silver trays with practiced ease. It was a world where wealth dictated respect, and status determined service. Seated at the corner booth was Jonathan Ellis, a billionaire real estate tycoon and one of the most influential men in America. Dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, his presence commanded attention. At 53, he exuded confidence, but behind his piercing blue eyes was a man too accustomed to power, too distant from the struggles of ordinary people. He glanced at his watch impatiently. Time was money, and tonight, he was here to discuss an upcoming multimillion-dollar deal. The waiter, a sharp-featured young man named Ethan Carter, approached with a practiced smile, until his eyes landed on a frail old man hesitantly stepping inside the restaurant. His tattered coat and worn-out shoes starkly contrasted with the opulence around him. Ethan's nose wrinkled in distaste. "Sir, I believe you're in the wrong place," he said coldly. The restaurant hushed slightly, eyes shifting toward the unfolding scene. Why did this old man dare step into a place where he clearly didn't belong? And who would come to his defense, if anyone at all? The dining hall, once filled with soft laughter and murmured conversations, now grew silent. All eyes flickered toward the entrance, where the frail old man stood hesitantly. His posture was slightly hunched, his hands trembling as he clutched a battered wool cap between his fingers. His coat, frayed at the edges, barely provided warmth against the bitter cold of a New York winter night. His shoes, scuffed, worn-out leather, told the story of miles walked with nowhere to rest. Ethan Carter, the young waiter, crossed his arms and glared. "Sir, I don't think this is the kind of place you're looking for," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The old man, Walter Harris, lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with both humility and quiet dignity. His voice cracked, but he steadied himself. "I was hoping for a warm meal." Ethan scoffed. "Do you even have the money to pay?" Across the room, Jonathan Ellis, the billionaire tycoon, watched with detached curiosity. He wasn't unfamiliar with people like this, beggars, drifters, those who had simply made poor choices in life. His philosophy had always been simple: you work for what you have. If you have nothing, then you haven't worked hard enough. The tension in the air thickened as Ethan continued, his voice now loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. "We have a dress code, sir. And I'm sure you can't afford anything on our menu." A few diners chuckled uncomfortably, while others turned away, not wanting to involve themselves. Walter's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't leave. Instead, he swallowed hard and reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills, small denominations, barely enough for even the cheapest appetizer on the menu. "Please," he said softly. "I just need something warm to eat." Ethan sneered. "That won't even cover the tip." Jonathan sighed, shifting in his seat. He wasn't one for unnecessary drama. His time was valuable, and this was nothing more than an unpleasant distraction. But as he prepared to return to his discussion, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the back of the restaurant. "That's enough." The firm yet calm tone belonged to none other than Michael Grayson, the restaurant's owner. The man had built this establishment from the ground up and was respected among the city's elite. Dressed in a crisp white chef's coat, his presence commanded attention as he stepped forward. Michael's sharp eyes locked onto Ethan. "Is this how we treat people now?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying undeniable authority. Ethan hesitated. Sir, I just thought. You thought what? Michael cut him off. That because this man doesn't fit the image of our usual guests, he doesn't deserve to be treated with dignity? Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of the room's silence pressed down on him. Michael turned to Walter, his expression softening. Please, have a seat, he said, gesturing toward an empty table. You're welcome here. Walter's eyes widened. He hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to object. But no one spoke. Slowly, he moved toward the table, his hands still trembling as he took a seat. Michael turned back to Ethan. Bring him a hot meal. Whatever he wants. And it's on the house. A flicker of resentment crossed Ethan's face, but he nodded stiffly and disappeared into the kitchen. Jonathan Ellis, still seated at his booth, found himself gripping the edge of the table. Something about the moment unsettled him. The way the restaurant had fallen silent. The way the old man had stood his ground, despite his frailty. The way Michael Grayson, a successful businessman, had chosen generosity over exclusivity. Jonathan had spent his entire life believing that wealth defined worth. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he felt something foreign, and he didn't like it. A heavy silence hung over Grayson's fine dining as Ethan returned from the kitchen, a plate of steaming food balanced in his hands. His jaw was tight, his movements stiff. He clearly resented being ordered to serve the old man. Still, under the watchful gaze of Michael Grayson, he had no choice. He set the plate down in front of Walter Harris with an audible clatter. Here, he muttered, barely masking his annoyance. The meal, succulent roast chicken, buttery mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread, was far beyond what Walter could have afforded. His hands trembled as he picked up the silverware, his eyes misting over. Thank you, Walter said quietly, looking up at Michael with genuine gratitude. Michael nodded. No one should go hungry. Across the room, Jonathan Ellis found himself gripping his wine glass a little too tightly. He had expected Michael to throw the old man out, not welcome him like a guest of honor. But the restaurant's reputation was built on exclusivity, on being a place where people like Walter simply didn't belong. His dinner companion, Richard Calloway, a fellow billionaire investor, chuckled dryly. Sentimental nonsense, he murmured, swirling his whiskey. People like that old man don't belong here. Feeding him once won't change anything. Jonathan hesitated. A part of him wanted to agree. And yet, something about Walter's quiet dignity unsettled him. The way the old man had accepted kindness without begging, the way he held his back straight despite the worn-out clothes. Michael pulled out a chair and sat across from Walter. What's your name? He asked. Walter chewed slowly, swallowing before answering. Walter Harris. Michael tilted his head. Where are you from, Walter? Walter hesitated, pushing his food around his plate. Finally he sighed. I used to be from here, he said. I worked construction for almost 40 years. Built half the skyscrapers in this city. He gave a sad chuckle. Then life happened. My wife got sick. Hospital bills wiped out our savings. After she passed, I lost the house. Then the job. The room was still. A few diners shifted uncomfortably. They had walked past homeless people on the streets before, never thinking twice. But hearing the story firsthand, seeing the man behind the struggle, made it impossible to ignore. Michael's expression didn't change. So, you helped build the city, and now the city has turned its back on you. Walter shrugged. That's just how it is. Across the room, Jonathan set down his glass. His father had been a construction worker before he built his empire. That could have been him. Ethan, who had been eavesdropping, scoffed. You expect us to believe that? Every homeless guy has a sob story. Michael's gaze snapped to him. Ethan, I think you've forgotten something important. Ethan raised an eyebrow. What's that? Michael leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. Compassion. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. I just don't see why we should pretend this guy belongs here. Michael exhaled slowly, his patience wearing thin. I started this restaurant not just to serve food, but to serve people. All people. His voice hardened. If that's a problem for you, you're welcome to find employment elsewhere. Ethan's face turned red. He opened his mouth to protest, then snapped it shut. He knew better than to challenge the owner any further. Walter, meanwhile, had stopped eating. His hands curled into fists in his lap. I didn't mean to cause trouble, he murmured. He swallowed. I just wanted to feel human again. The words hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. He had spent his life chasing success, surrounding himself with luxury, convinced that wealth was the only thing that mattered. But here was a man who had lost everything, and all he wanted was a little dignity. For the first time in years, Jonathan questioned himself. Then, before he could say a word, the restaurant doors swung open. A group of well-dressed patrons strode in, laughing and chatting, until their eyes landed on Walter. Their expressions darkened. One of them, a woman in a designer dress, wrinkled her nose. "Michael, what's going on here?" she demanded. "Why is there a homeless man eating in the middle of your restaurant?" Michael's eyes flashed. "He's my guest." A murmur of discontent rippled through the crowd. Some diners whispered among themselves. A few even got up to leave. Jonathan tensed. He knew how this worked. Wealthy people didn't like being reminded of struggle. They paid to keep hardship out of sight, out of mind. And now he had a choice. Stay silent like he always had, or do something that went against everything he had ever believed. A tense silence gripped Grayson's fine dining as the well-dressed patrons stared at Walter Harris, their expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disdain. A few murmured in disapproval, while others subtly motioned for their checks, eager to leave before the presence of a homeless man could ruin their evening. At the center of it all, Jonathan Ellis sat frozen in his seat. His instincts, honed by years of navigating high society, screamed at him to do nothing, to let the moment pass. He had spent his entire life abiding by unspoken rules. Wealth meant power, status meant respect, and people like Walter belonged on the outside looking in. And yet, Jonathan's fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass. Across the room, Michael Grayson stood firm, unwavering as the social elite scrutinized his decision. Ethan Carter, the arrogant waiter, hovered by the kitchen door, eyes darting between Michael and the disgruntled customers, as if waiting to see which way the power would shift. Then, a woman in a pearl necklace scoffed loudly. "Michael, you have a business to run. This isn't a charity." Another man in an expensive suit sneered. "If you start letting beggars dine here, you'll lose your real clientele." Jonathan watched as Walter slowly placed his fork down. The old man had seen this before. The whispers. The quiet rejection that cut deeper than words ever could. He swallowed hard and pushed his chair back. I should go," he murmured. His voice was small, filled with resignation. Michael turned to him, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to." Walter offered a sad smile, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He knew when he wasn't wanted. He reached for his worn-out cap and stood, his frail frame hunched under the weight of decades of struggle. And that was when Jonathan Ellis made his choice. For the first time in years, he didn't think about what was expected of him. He didn't weigh the consequences, didn't calculate the cost. He simply acted. Jonathan stood abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping against the marble floor. The sudden movement drew every eye in the room to him. "Sit down, Walter," he said firmly. Walter hesitated. His weary gaze met Jonathan's, searching for the catch, for the inevitable dismissal that always followed empty kindness. Jonathan exhaled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out his black titanium credit card, a symbol of his wealth, his privilege, his power, and slapped it onto the table in front of Walter. "Order whatever you want," Jonathan said, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "Order everything on the menu if you feel like it. It's on me." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Richard Calloway, Jonathan's business associate, nearly choked on his whiskey. "Jonathan, what the hell are you doing?" Jonathan didn't take his eyes off Walter. "What I should have done a long time ago." Walter blinked, his lips parting in shock. "Son, you don't have to." "I want to," Jonathan interrupted, his voice softer now. Ethan scoffed. "Oh, so now you're trying to be a hero?" Jonathan turned to him, his jaw set. "No. But I am trying to be a better man. The tension in the air thickened. The wealthy patrons stared in disbelief. Jonathan Ellis, the billionaire, the untouchable mogul, was openly siding with a homeless man. Michael, ever the quiet observer, watched Jonathan with something almost like approval. Richard leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper. Jonathan, think about this. You're making a spectacle of yourself. Jonathan let out a humorless chuckle. You know what's funny, Richard? I spent my entire life worrying about my image. About what people like you think of me. He shook his head, something shifting inside him. But I don't care anymore. Richard's face twisted in frustration. You're ruining your reputation. Jonathan smirked. Maybe my reputation needed ruining. And then, in an act of defiance that shocked even himself, Jonathan reached into his wallet, pulled out another card, and handed it to Walter. This is a hotel card. It's good for a year. You'll have a place to stay. Walter's hands shook as he took it. His throat bobbed, emotion flickering in his glassy eyes. I don't know what to say. Jonathan smiled. Then don't say anything. Just accept it. A few diners rose to leave, clearly disapproving of the scene unfolding before them. But Jonathan didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Ethan, still clinging to his arrogance, scoffed one last time. This is ridiculous. Michael turned to him, his expression unreadable. You're fired. Ethan's smirk vanished. What? You heard me, Michael said evenly. Get your things and leave. Ethan sputtered, but Michael had already turned away. Defeated, the young waiter stormed toward the back, slamming the kitchen door behind him. Jonathan turned back to Walter, who was staring at the hotel card in disbelief. Tears welled in the old man's eyes. I don't deserve this, Walter whispered. Jonathan's expression softened. Yeah, you do. Michael clapped a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. Took you long enough to figure that out. Jonathan let out a breath. He had spent his whole life believing that success was about power and wealth. But tonight, he learned that real success, the kind that mattered, was measured in kindness. Walter, overcome with emotion, reached out and shook Jonathan's hand. It was the firmest, most genuine handshake Jonathan had ever received. And for the first time in years, he felt like a man worth being. The restaurant slowly returned to normal, but something had shifted. People who had once ignored Walter now saw him. A few even approached, offering quiet words of kindness. Jonathan sat back down, exhaling as the weight of his old self finally lifted. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew. Tonight was only the beginning. A ripple of change spread through Grayson's fine dining, subtle yet undeniable. Conversations, once filled with whispered disapproval, now carried a different tone: curiosity, admiration, and quiet reflection. The same patrons who had judged Walter Harris moments ago now stole glances at him, their expressions softened by guilt and self-awareness. Walter, still gripping the hotel card Jonathan had given him, wiped at his eyes. I don't know how to thank you, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Jonathan, who had spent years detached from human connection, felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest, the warmth of doing something not for profit, not for status, but simply because it was right. You don't need to thank me, he said, leaning back in his chair. Just use it. Take care of yourself. Across the room, Michael Grayson observed the scene with quiet satisfaction. He had always known there was more to Jonathan than cold ambition. Tonight, he had seen the billionaire's walls crack, revealing the man beneath. The once disgruntled diners slowly returned to their meals, but not without a noticeable shift in their behavior. A woman in an emerald gown whispered something to her husband, who then called over a waiter and discreetly paid for another table's meal. A businessman in the corner, who had previously scowled at Walter's presence, set his own untouched dessert in front of a young busboy, offering him a smile. The air in the restaurant had changed. Compassion had replaced judgment. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Ethan Carter was fuming. Humiliated. Fired in front of the entire restaurant. This is bullshit, he muttered under his breath, shoving his apron into his locker. A sous chef passing by shook his head. You did it to yourself. Ethan turned sharply. Excuse me? The chef folded his arms. You looked at that man and saw a nuisance. Michael looked at him and saw a human being. That's the difference between you two. Ethan scoffed. I don't need a lecture. No, the chef said. You need a lesson in decency. Ethan had no response. He slammed his locker shut and stormed out of the kitchen. But as he reached the door, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, at Walter, now eating in peace, at Jonathan, the billionaire who had just risked his reputation for a man society had written off. And for the first time, doubt flickered in Ethan's mind. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. Walter took a slow, deep breath, letting the taste of the warm meal settle on his tongue. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider looking in. He turned to Michael. You remind me of my wife, he said with a bittersweet chuckle. She used to say that kindness was the greatest investment a man could make. Michael smiled. She was a wise woman. Walter nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He turned to Jonathan, his gaze filled with something far more valuable than gratitude, respect. You're a good man, Jonathan, Walter said. Jonathan exhaled. I'm trying to be. Walter extended his hand. This time, Jonathan didn't hesitate. He shook it firmly, sealing something unspoken between them. From across the room, Richard Calloway watched the exchange, his lips pressed into a thin line. He could already see the headlines, Billionaire Defends Homeless Man in Five-Star Restaurant. He knew this would change things. Investors would talk. Business partners would whisper. But as he looked at Jonathan, who looked freer than he ever had before, Richard wondered if, for the first time in his life, his friend had made a decision that actually mattered. Jonathan caught his gaze and smirked. Still think I'm ruining my reputation? Richard sighed, then shook his head with a reluctant chuckle. No, Ellis. I think you just saved it. The tension in the restaurant had dissipated, replaced by an unspoken understanding among the guests. Some left deep in thought, others stayed, their attitudes noticeably different. As Walter finished his meal, Jonathan gestured toward the front door. Come on. Let's get you to that hotel. Walter hesitated but then nodded, standing taller than before. As they stepped out into the cool night air, Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Tonight, for the first time, he had used his power for something more than wealth. And he had never felt richer. The cold night air wrapped around Jonathan Ellis and Walter Harris as they stepped onto the quiet streets of Manhattan. The city, always alive with movement, seemed different tonight, slower, softer, more human. Walter clutched the hotel key card in his worn hands, running his fingers over its smooth surface like it was something fragile, something unreal. He glanced at Jonathan, his gaze a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. You know, Walter murmured, I spent years thinking people had forgotten me. That the world had moved on without me. Jonathan stuffed his hands into his coat pockets, his expression unreadable. I spent years thinking the world revolved around me. He exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe we were both wrong. Walter chuckled, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of hardship and resilience. They reached the entrance of the Grand Terrace Hotel, its warm golden glow spilling onto the sidewalk. The doorman, a man in a crisp navy uniform, straightened as they approached, his practiced politeness flickering with hesitation when he saw Walter's tattered coat. Jonathan didn't wait for a question. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Walter's shoulder, a silent declaration. He's with me. That was all it took. The doorman nodded, stepping aside. As they entered, Walter's breath hitched. The polished marble floors, the chandelier overhead, the scent of fresh linens. A world so far from the park benches and alleyways he had come to know. Jonathan handed the concierge a black card. Whatever he needs, put it on this. The young woman at the desk barely concealed her surprise but took the card with a respectful nod. Walter turned to Jonathan, his voice tight with emotion. I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay you. Jonathan shook his head. This isn't a loan, Walter. It's a fresh start. Walter swallowed hard, then extended his hand. Jonathan took it, a firm grip sealing something deeper than charity, mutual respect. As Walter disappeared down the hall toward his first real bed in years, Jonathan remained in the lobby, staring after him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like the wealthiest man in the room. He felt like a man worth being. The next morning, Jonathan sat in his penthouse, his usual routine feeling empty. The endless emails, the high-stakes meetings, the meticulously crafted image, none of it seemed as important as it had yesterday. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake below him. Somewhere down there, Walter was waking up in a real bed, in a place where he belonged. And Jonathan? For the first time in decades, he wondered if he had spent his life climbing the wrong ladder. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Emily, poked her head in. "Sir? Your board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Jonathan turned, considering her words. Then slowly he smiled. "Cancel it." Emily blinked. "Sir?" Jonathan stood, grabbing his coat. "I have something more important to do today." And with that, he walked out, not as the billionaire mogul, but as a man on a new path. Change begins with a choice. Jonathan had spent his life believing that power was measured in wealth, but that night in the restaurant, he had learned the truth. Real power lies in kindness, in seeing people, in making a difference. We walk past people like Walter every day, on the streets, in diners, in quiet corners where they've been forgotten. But what if, instead of walking past them, we stopped? What if we chose to see them? Because sometimes, a single act of kindness is all it takes to change a life. Who will you choose to see today?